Lesson 11, Stepping Through Code. In this lesson, I'm going to take a look at an amazing debugging tool that will basically let you run one line of your macro at a time so that we can switch back to Excel and see the results of that line of code. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to record a simple little macro here. This macro will go down to the end of our data set and we'll build a small table with the three regions, East, Central, and West, and put in a formula to get the total for those three regions. But while I record it, I want to look at both the Excel screen and also the Visual Basic window. Now, how do we do this? The first thing we have to do, usually I have Excel in full screen mode, so I want to come up here and click Restore Down, and then I'm going to resize my Excel window so that way I can see a lot behind it. Now I have to be careful. You'll notice that the ribbon actually kind of minimizes here, and it's possible for you to get too small where the ribbon disappears. So you don't want to go that small. You still want to be able to see the ribbons. That way you can continue to work. I mean, particularly back here on the Developer tab, you at least need to have access to Record and the Relative and then Stop. We also want to see Visual Basic at the same time. So here's our Visual Basic window. I'm working in Lesson 11. I want to go into Modules and Module 1 so that way I can see the code window. Now there's a little bit of code left over from before. I'll get rid of that and switch back to Excel. Okay, so now I've achieved almost the perfect combination. I can see both the code pane, I'll make the, and the Excel window at the same time. Now this is really cool because you can actually watch the macro recorder write your macro for you. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So we click the Record New Macro button, and I'll call this Add Summary Table. Shortcut key of Control-Shift-T, stored in this workbook, and click OK. All right, as soon as I click OK, already the VBA has added the beginning and ending of the macro. It shows me what the shortcut is. If I would have put a description, it would have placed that there. Okay, so now I want to make sure that relative reference is turned on. I click Use Relative Reference, so we have a nice orange glow behind there. Notice that does not do anything to our macro. And I now press the End key and the down arrow key. And you can see that the code for that is selection.endxldown.select. If I press the down arrow key twice more, and then go to the right, they actually wrote some code, active cell.offset 2, 0, and then when I went to the right, it did 2, 3. So this is telling me I went down 2 rows and over 3 columns. You're actually kind of learning a little bit as you watch the macro recorder respond to your actions. So here I'm going to type the word Central, and I'll go down, and then East, I'll go down, and then West, and choose the first formula. So we can see that as we type Central, they used a property called formula R1C1, and then again they did something here with the offset. We don't quite understand this code, but we can see that every time we type something and then move, it's adding 2 lines of code for us. Now, let me write the formula here. So we'll use equal sum if, and I can use all the regular tools. So I want to take a look and see if these items here from B2 to B18 are equal to the value to the left of me. And if they are, then I want to add up the corresponding value from column E. Now I want to take a look at this formula before I finish it off because I have to add some dollar signs in it. I know that I want to start at $2. The B18's allowed to change. D20 is relative, and then $2. So I add those 2 dollar signs in. I'm going to press Control Enter, which will accept that formula but stay in the current cell. All right, and as soon as I've entered that formula, I get selection.formula R1C1, and it puts my formula in. It's a strange bit of nomenclature that we don't understand yet. That's called R1C1. We'll take a look at that again later, and then I'll take my formula and copy it down a couple of cells, and it does selection.autofill, and then selected a range of cells. When I turn off relative reference and go back and click on A1, you see that it does range A1 select. So this is pretty interesting. You can actually, if your screen is wide enough, watch Excel write the macro in response to each item that you do. Okay, well that's great if you're writing macros, but what if someone has sent you a macro? So I'll stop recording here. You'll see that that actually did not change the macro at all, but it's important that we do stop recording. And I'll delete the stuff that we added. I'm actually also going to take a few extra records here and just paste them below my data to prove that this is actually working for me. And I start back up here in cell A1. Okay, so of course if I would run the macro on the right hand side, it would just very, very quickly run, and I wouldn't get to see things happen step by step. But what I want to do instead is I want to use something on the debug menu. Normally we could run the macro using this run button, but instead I'm going to go to debug and say that I want to step into the macro, and you'll see that the shortcut for that is F8. So in this case, I'm actually going to rearrange the windows here. I'll restore down so that way I can see the VBA window, but I also want to see Excel at the same time. And remember, the shortcut key is F8. That's the same as using debug step into. So I press F8 here, and it shows a line in yellow. This is the line that's about to get executed. Now this first line is just saying we're about to start the macro. So I press F8, and that line gets executed. You notice that it skips over the comments. Anything that starts with an apostrophe is a comment. And now it's about to run the line of code called selection.end_xldown.select. If I want to see what happens when I run that line of code, I simply press F8, and I can see in the Excel window that we jumped from cell A1 down to the last row with data. Now this next one, active cell.offset 2, 3, range A1 select. When I press F8, I can actually see what that's doing. So it looks like we went down 2 rows and over 3 columns. So from that, I can kind of guess that this is telling us how many rows down and how many columns over we want to move. Next one, active cell.formula equals central. When I press that, you see that it types the word central. And then the next line of code, the offset, is where it moves down 1 row. Now it's going to type the word east. I press F8, and the next line of code moves me down 1 row. Type the word west, and the next line of code, offset -2, 1. Well, the -2 says we're going down 2 rows, we're going down -2 rows. So what's that? That means that we're moving back up, and then 1 column over. When I press F8, sure enough, I see that that happens. Now here, it's about to type in a big long formula. We press F8, and it's interesting, I'm going to make the Excel window larger here, that although VBA talked in terms of R1C1, the formula that actually gets entered and what we see is the A1 style references. Again, we'll talk more about R1C1 as we go. Now it's about to do a selection.autofill. That's basically when I drag the fill handle down. So we'll press F8 here, and it copied our formula. It also, this bit of code here that was put in by the macro recorder is kind of silly. It now selects those 3 cells, which really is not necessary because in fact we're going back up to select range A1. So I can press F8 to jump back. At some point I would realize that this line of code is actually extraneous. We don't need it. And I can delete that line of code. There's many other things in here that are actually extraneous that we don't need at all, but that was one that as I was going through I noticed it, and so certainly you can get rid of that and your macros will run just a little bit faster. Notice that we're still in break mode here. We're still running this code. We need to press F8 to get through the end sub so that way we can be out of break mode. Lots of things you cannot do while you're in break mode, so you always want to make sure to allow the macro to finish. So we have a couple of very cool tricks here. The first trick is to leave the Excel window on top but make it small enough so we can see the code pane behind and watch the macro actually get written. You can see as you do each step exactly which lines of code show up. There were a few instances where when I did one thing, for example, when I pressed enter to accept the word central, Excel moved down to the next cell. Well, that actually generated 2 lines of code, one to put in the word central and one to move down a line. So you'll see that sometimes. You'll do one thing in Excel and a whole bunch of things happen in the macro recorder. And sometimes we do something in Excel, for example, turn on relative reference, and nothing happens in the macro recorder. And so you can kind of get a feel as you work through it. And then, what we have far more often is we inherit a macro from someone, and we need to see how that macro is working, or a section of the macro isn't working. Well, by using the step into, the debug step into, or the F8 key, a great way to very carefully go through line by line by line, and after running each line, we can actually examine the code and figure out what's going on. It's interesting here. I want to point this out. If I start to run this macro with F8 and I would discover an error, maybe it's not supposed to be the word central, it's supposed to be, we had an abbreviation or something like that, SENT period. So if I discover that, I can change that line of code and I can actually make Excel go back and run that line again. Here's how I do it. I take the yellow arrow here and I drag it up, and now we're about to run that line of code again. So I press F8 and it will redo the line. So in many cases you can actually use this yellow arrow and drag to a specific spot. In this case I jumped over some lines of code. Those lines of code were not run. Or I can go back and run some lines of code again. And this is kind of a good place to experiment. What would happen if we ran this first line of code when we were not in cell A1? Well, if I run that line of code, you see I end up down at the end of the spreadsheet, 1048576, and that's going to be bad. So you can learn a lot about the behavior of VBA and its impact on Excel by using this technique of stepping through the code and seeing the result of Excel. Now, if you have a small screen and it's not possible for you to get both the code pane and the Excel window side by side, you can always do this by keeping both items full screen. Basically run a line of code here in VBA and then switch back to Excel to see the result. You can use Control Tab to switch to Excel and see that we're now at the end. Run the next line of code, see that we've now jumped down 2 rows and over 3 columns. Run the next line of code, see that it typed that word, and so on. A little bit more tedious to jump back and forth. It's really nice, especially if you have a big screen, to just go through and allow this to run and see each thing side by side. Well, one of the great debugging tools. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about the immediate pane. The immediate pane is a great place to get all of your answers. So I hope you found this lesson helpful.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live Lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.